Okay, well, it's 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for everybody for attending. Appreciate that. I know that it's been a really rough week. So glad you could join us to go to another cost center manager briefing. So we'll go ahead and get started. As always, feel free to put questions in the chat as we're going. If we don't get to them all, we will send out something afterwards. We will try our best. Usually our small team is sitting together as we do this so we can kind of cue each other or see what's going on in the chat. But obviously we're all remote right now, so might make it a little more difficult, but we'll try our hardest to get through questions too. So again, this is one-way audio. Use the chat feature if you'd like. This session is being recorded so that it can be made available to those that couldn't attend today. And again, our intent in all of these is to review responsibilities that would be of the cost center manager and Workday. It's not meant to replace training. And just because you are on this call or these sessions doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the cost center manager role in Workday, but you've been identified as somebody who has a fiscal role in your college or VP unit, and very likely may have a cost center manager role. And again, these are all, in general, great processes to understand more if you're involved at all from a fiscal perspective. Let's go ahead and go on to the agenda. So again, we'll talk about our purpose and our cadence for these sessions, talk about some terminology changes. We are going to talk through the P-card process today in more detail. Last time we met, we talked through travel and expense, and we discussed P-card in terms of how it relates to travel. So today we wanted to talk about more regarding a department P-card example. So we have Robin Gasson joining us today to do that demo for us. We also have Lisa Plaga on the line available for questions if anything comes up regarding policy, or again, anything else she can help us with, but definitely policy questions. I know there tends to be a lot of policy questions around this. We also have Drew Jason on the phone with us because again, we have some changes coming with the Office Sponsored Program card program too. And then finally, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about internal service delivery also. I just have a couple of some slides on those. We're not necessarily going to do a demo today on that process, but definitely wanted to talk about the process a little bit. We do get a lot of questions about that, and it is a process that is definitely changing. Okay, so we'll go ahead and talk through. So again, the purpose of this is really because this population on our call today is just going to be so heavily involved in all of these transactions within Workday, trying to do what we can to start to prepare you ahead of time. Again, today we'll focus on P-card internal service delivery, and our intent each month is to highlight a different process. So actually, if we go ahead and go to the next slide, I think we have our timeline. So if you remember, we started out in December kind of in general talking about approval workflows and the role of the cost center manager. In January, we went through purchase requests. In February, we talked about travel and expense. Today, we're going to talk about P-cards and internal service delivery. And then in April, our goal is to talk about a new process in Workday, and it's called miscellaneous payments. So that will be, I think, our last one, because at that point, we will start to get into formal training, which obviously you all will be heavily involved in. Okay, so in terms of P-card updates, so we have a couple terminology changes that we always like to share. So in today's world, we call it P-card reallocation process. And in the future state, really what that P-card manager will be doing, or the P-card holder will be creating an expense report. So that's a key terminology difference. Again, just like all of these, anytime we say chart field or chart of account today in Workday terms, we're talking about work tags, and especially when we get into P-card and travel, we actually have something called expense items, which then translate into spend categories, which is a work tag. So we'll take a look at that when Robin is in a transaction in Workday. And then finally today, we might call it interdepartmental billing, or an IDB, that your staff might do today in terms of for all these internal vendor billings. And in future state, it's going to be called an ISD, an internal service delivery. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So in terms of PCard process changes, so what's not changing? So we will still have one PCard manager per PCard, and I've had quite a few questions on this. Based off of that PCard manager that's held in the PNC system, that will be how Workday will know who should be able to expense those PCards. So it'll all be based off of that. There's no need to request a role for that for the PCard manager within Workday. That will automatically happen. Just like today, the user would check out the PCard. There'll be a log just like today. It's going to be updated. The PCard office is working on what that updated log would look like. The user would go use the card and come back and return it. Service Center and Get Cards will still exist and function the same as today. So really no differences there. So let's look at the other side. So what is changing? So again, what we call today the reallocation process will occur in Workday, and it will instead what we'll be doing is we'll be expensing charges to the right FDM work tags. So similar to what you're saying, but we're due today, but we're definitely getting rid of that terminology of reallocation, and instead we're doing an expense report. We're expensing the charges. We will use the create expense report task, and that will be, like I said, automatically assigned to the PCard manager. The PCard manager will have the ability to reassign travel-related charges to an employee so that those charges can be made available on their expense report. And we showed that, I think, last time when Robin was demoing. So can the PCard manager role be delegated to another individual? So we may want to kind of take that aside for now. We do have
Hi, Holly. Hi.
Yeah.
You know, this is Lisa Plaga, everybody. Hi, how you doing? The PCard manager role should not be delegated. Whoever the card's name is in should be the PCard manager. And if you want to delegate the PCard manager to others, then they should be the PCard manager. From a dean perspective, I would presume a dean is never a PCard manager, just based on all their other duties. Deans should have individual cards, and yes, an expense data entry specialist can go in and allocate those transactions appropriately.
So good clarification. So for the individual cards, that expense data entry analyst could assist with this.
Correct.
Perfect. And we can make sure to note that for some trainings too. And just actually, this goes really well with what Lisa just said there, because if you do think you need to make changes to your current PCard managers, or who is responsible for those cards, consider doing that before Workday and doing that through your normal process that you would through the PCard office. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll start out on this slide, and if there's questions, we'll definitely invoke Drew and Lisa. So in terms of the Amex program, I think hopefully all of you have heard that that program is going to be discontinued, and we're going to be using the PNC program for both OSP and the university. So there is going to be a process in which the principal investigators or a grants manager, that office will be able to apply for a PNC card. It's going to be different than today. There will not be a card per grant, but instead you would have a sponsored program card if that is believed necessary. The last day to transact on the current American Express card will be May 20th. So that's like the end of that cycle date. Within the next month is our goal that we'll be sending instructions on out to current Amex card holders for how to reapply, and that process of reapplying for the new PNC cards. Okay, so that will be coming. So the new PNC cards will be able to be starting to be used on June 26th. That would be the beginning of that cycle. That would then be all completely in Workday. We will, if those expense transactions, we'll be going through all those cards, I'm sorry, will be going through the SFO for approval. So this will be just like a normal going through DocuSign, same process today for getting for applying for a PNC card. So same approval, same process for the OSP cards. There will also be OSP, this is a new thing, there will be OSP department cards will be available for you to apply for your units to apply for. So very similar today. Let's see. So Lisa, go ahead. Go ahead if you want to make your point there. Or was there a question? I'm sorry. The P-card manager.
Yes, Holly, there was a question. Is
yes,
the
sorry.
P-card manager and expense data specialist can be different? And the answer is yes. The P-card manager is a person within a college or unit that manages the P-card, the departmental P-card for that college unit, department, etc. Expense data entry specialist is a role in Workday that you can be assigned to enter expense transactions and spend authorizations on behalf of another individual.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, Drew, Lisa, some of these might be for you about the question from Doris here. Will we be sending out info to current Amex card holders without consulting SFOs first? I don't know if we know
So
that.
I've already spoken with SFOs for the major areas for research, but we will be consulting with SFOs and cost center managers as well.
Before you reach out to the current Amex holders, Drew, do you know?
Correct. Before we send those applications.
Okay. Okay, it looks like we've got some other questions here. When can people start applying for the PNC? That was what I was saying. I think we're about, there's been obviously with a lot of things going on here. We're hoping within the next month. Okay, will current Amex cardholders who want a PNC card need to go through all the P-card training? Lisa, Drew?
Yes, we would expect any P-card holder to go through all of the required P-card training.
Okay. Will department P-card be same usage as OSP cards? Or are these still separate? There's still two separate cards.
Correct. Yes, you would continue to use your department P-card for the items you purchase with your department P-card today. In addition, you can have an OSP department card that can be used for OSP type transactions. But the transactions do need to be kept separate.
Okay, can employees other than PIs, which have to be faculty right now, have a P card for OSP projects? So that would be the department card, right, Lisa, that they could have a P card manager responsible.
Are they, if they're people that work on grants and need to charge to grants, like maybe a lab manager or something? Is that, I think that may be where the question's getting at. But yes, all transactions for OSP projects need to go on an OSP card.
Okay, and then for OSP department cards, will one card for all PIs in the department or one card per PI?
That depends on how you manage your departments and your grants.
So it's kind of similar to today with the university card where you might have an individual one for some of your people, but then you also have a department one, again, depending on the need. Current list of restrictions for Amex is lengthy. Is airfare the only restriction?
There will still be additional restrictions because there are additional restrictions on all grants expenditures, but that'll be part of the supplementary information that we'll provide with the application material.
Okay.
Airfare is just the information that the card will not allow you to purchase airfare. It'll be rejected.
So the next question: if PI already has a PNC card, will they convert to be able to use these for grants? So this is a separate card, PNC card, because we can't commingle the sponsor program charges on the cards with the university one. So it's a separate card for the OSP PNC card, and it would have to be applied for and approved by the SFO. Nothing's automatic or going to be converted for those. Okay, then let's take one more question. Doris, sure. Can you have multiple OSP department cards or one per college? Lisa or Drew?
You could have multiple. It's very much based on the operations of your college and how you guys are organized and what your needs are.
Perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Thank you guys for all your questions. Okay, so PCard process. So we will again start out with whoever, again, and this is in the view of thinking of it as a department card. So I'm someone in the department that needs to go purchase something that is not on contract that I can get through the marketplace. Something I would use per policy, use for the PCard today, the department PCard. I would go and sign it out with the log. I'd go to my PCard manager, sign it out just like I do today, complete that information on the log. I would go and use the card. I'd come back and return the card and sign off on the log. And then my PCard manager would verify that all the correct information has been noted on the log, that we've gotten any receipts that we need. And then the PCard manager would go ahead and log into Workday and complete the expense report. And that's what Robin's going to show us today. And then after that, that expense report will workflow to the cost center manager. The cost center manager will be able to review so they could make edits if they need to the FDM values or add to the business purpose, the justification, and then make sure they're looking at it from an initial compliance viewpoint, just like we've talked about on all these other transactions. The cost center manager is reviewing, and then it would move on, assuming they then approve it. It would go to the business operations center, so to wherever your appropriate service center is today. If it has a OSP grant on it, it would go to the grants shared service center for a more thorough review on compliance and completeness of that transaction. And then if that particular transaction is greater than $2,500 or in a high risk spend category and more than 200, it would also go to the department leader. Again, very consistent, I think, with what we've talked about before. Just a reminder, some of those high risk categories, which probably could be prevalent on some of these cards, would be meals, entertainment, catering. Those are those types of purchases. Okay, so let's take a quick look. Looks like we have some other questions. What happens if the PCard manager, cost center manager are the same person? If that happens, then in general in our workflows, if the PCard manager has initiated that transaction, then they cannot approve it. So they would be dropped off from being able to approve that, and the backup cost center manager would need to approve it. And that's why when we worked on all of our security assignments, we're really working hard to make sure everybody has a backup for those cost center managers in the system. Could the expense data specialist be someone in the business office? It definitely does not, isn't somebody in the service center, so I don't see why it couldn't be someone in the business office.
Yeah, I don't know why it couldn't either, Holly.
Okay, cool. Where does getting the terms and conditions signed fit into this process? I don't know, Lisa, if you want to.
That would be independent of this process. So getting the terms and conditions approved would go through, depending on the size of the transaction, either go through the purchasing email box or through the OLA contract portal for signature.
Perfect. So cost center managers can be PCard managers. Lisa, was there any specific restrictions that we were putting on that?
Yes, cost center managers can be PCard managers. However, they cannot approve the transactions associated with their PCards.
Yeah.
So it would be, as Holly spoke about, the backup cost center manager approving those transactions.
Perfect. And Lisa, that last one, is that correct? Weekly, on a minimum
Yes,
weekly?
we're requesting weekly so that everybody's keeping up with the volume of potential transactions that are on the cards.
Perfect. That is before the card is used, correct?
I'm sorry, Pam, I'm not sure what that
Yeah, I'm not
question is
trying to-
getting to.
We can come back to that maybe.
Oh, I think it's a follow-up to her terms and conditions question.
Oh, right. Got it.
So yes, you would want to review terms and conditions prior to before the transaction is happening.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, thank you guys for all the questions. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to let Robin do a demo.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to first ask if I can get some confirmation that you're seeing Workday right now on your screen.
Yep.
Okay,
Good.
Good. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to be using a proxy to go in and create the expense report. And just a disclaimer, also to the data that we're using for this demo is test data. So I don't want folks to get worried that I'm talking about transactions or making up things about transactions that are just in the tenant today for our test purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and start proxy as Ralph Orr, and Ralph is a department P-card manager. And as Lisa was saying earlier, the expectation is that the P-card manager is doing a couple of things. They're keeping an eye on where that P-card is in terms of being signed out on the log, and also to organizing all of the documentation so that they can do this expense report on a weekly basis. So the task that Ralph is going to do each week is what we call create expense report. And I apologize, I'm working with a faulty keyboard today. And you may recall we did look at creating an expense report at the last webinar when we were talking through the back end of travel and doing the travel reimbursement. A couple of things to point out with the expense report when talking in terms of expensing a department card, we're always going to be selecting this first radio button that says create new expense report. We're not going to be bringing in a spend authorization, so we want to make sure that we're creating a new expense report. As I've been demoing this, I've been advising folks to come up with either some sort of a college or VP consistent way of filling out the memo for your P-card managers, just to help with segregating out what the expense report is for. So we're just going to say that this is the weekly MAE department P-card expenses. The date will pre-populate to the date that the expense report is being created. The business purpose that we want individuals to use in creating this expense report is non-travel. And as you note here, that work tags are going to default based off of where Ralph is set up with his payroll costing. There is a place on the expense lines, and I'll show you in a minute, where you can actually change these work tags, but I really wouldn't worry about changing them at the header level at this point, because I'm going to assume that each P-card transaction that takes place is going to have probably a separate set of work tags that need to be populated for those items. When Ralph comes into see all the P-card transactions that have loaded from the bank and that are ready for him to expense. So you can see here Ralph has a couple of different cards. I think a best practice would be to create an expense report for each separate card so that you can keep all of that activity clearly defined. And for this expense report, Ralph is just going to, he's only received documentation for the first 3 transactions on card ending 4204. So he's going to go ahead and click these 3 transactions, say OK, and now we're going to go into the separate lines of the expense report. And immediately we get errors popping up, and that's expected. The errors are because we haven't yet selected our expense item. And again, just to remind everyone, expense item will map to a spend category, and spend categories map to ledger accounts. So, you know, the bank isn't going to be intuitive enough to know what that expense line equates to in our Workday system. So we will need to make sure that we're putting that information in. So if we start with this first one, we'll go ahead and note a few things here that the bank file does bring in. It does bring in the date of the transaction and the dollar amount. And in some instances, it will also bring in the vendor. But I'm not exactly sure what this is for specifically, but I'm just going to type in supplies and take a guess that this is an office supply. And you'll notice once I click office supplies, some additional information is being asked of me over here to the right-hand side. And the first thing that's required is business reason. So this is more of that justification that we ask people to put in to help support the business purpose. So we'll just have to say, for this one, I'm just going to say emergency supplies. Not in marketplace. And then scrolling down below, I will need to select a file or a receipt to attach to this transaction. I'm going to check the receipt included checkbox and move on to my next transaction. I'm going to pause just for a second while the system is bringing up that transaction. Are there any questions from what we have shown so far? I'm going to check the chat really quick here. Okay, so in this next transaction, I'm actually going to show you how to change the work tags. And we are actually going to change the work tags and split the transaction funding. So now we're in this transaction with Priority Designs, Inc. And we are going to say that this is advertising. So I'm going to type that into my box here, advertising services. We have the dollar amount pre-populated here, but in this, for this transaction, the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering is going to want to split this funding with one of their activities and events. So before I do the actual split, I'm going to come over here and type in my business reason. And this is advertising for student open house. And I do want to split the funding, and I want to change up some of the work tags. And to do that in Workday, I'm going to come over here to this area called itemization. And it's showing me the total amount that I have available to itemize. and I'm going to click the Add button. And that's going to open up another window that's going to allow me to change the work tags associated with this transaction and also allow me to split the dollar amount. So for this specific transaction, the department with its general fund is going to share half of the cost of this advertising. And you can see here it did bring in my business reason as well. I'm going to add a second line here. And for my second line, I'm going to add an activity and event. It's going to bring in that additional work tag. Now, if I wanted to change the cost center, I could also hit this X button and type in another cost center. So maybe for this one, maybe the college office decided that they were going to contribute some money to this transaction. So I'm going to cross out of there and I'm just going to type in engineering administration and make sure that everything is complete here. I will need to also put in that dollar amount. All of my required fields are populated and then I'm going to click done. The key thing for us to remind people of is if we're using this itemization area to change work tags or to split the transaction, you'll note that it removed the cost centers that originally populated with that charge. And we'll need to make sure that people don't see this as empty and need to feel the need to come back in and populate those. So now all of the work tags related to this $412 are captured in this itemization. And again, I'm going to attach my receipt, click receipt included, and move on to my next transaction. And I'm going to take a minute here to check to see if we have any comments.
Yeah, Robin, looks like we have a couple questions.
Sure.
One about the memo field and what would that be utilized for?
The memo field can be utilized for a whole host of things. I think for some transactions, we do utilize memo for more of a business purpose. It could be I don't know, maybe an additional piece of information that isn't captured in the justification or in the credit card information that comes over that needs to be denoted there.
Okay. Another one we have is the merchant field. Can we change that to be more clear than what is coming in from the credit card company?
I think we're kind of tied to what the credit card company passes over to us.
Okay.
Because that's a direct feed from the bank file.
Next one from Catherine. Does the expense report, keeps shifting on me. Does the expense report have to include all of the work tags before submitting to the cost center manager? Or can the cost center manager enter the correct work tags?
There are required work tags before that must be included in the transaction before it can be submitted. And you'll see these marked here with the star next to them. So cost center fund balancing unit and any additional work tags such as function are all required prior to submitting that transaction. And if they're not included, there will be a hard critical error that will stop the transaction from moving forward. But if someone chooses any of these required incorrectly, we do have some validation that looks to see that certain combinations of work tags makes sense before that transaction goes forward. But if you aren't getting any errors and there still may have been something that was selected incorrectly, the cost center manager can change those.
Awesome. The next one is, what is that little personal expense box for? Right below it.
Yeah, I was wondering if somebody was going to notice that. So this personal expense checkbox, this is a Workday delivered checkbox, and we can't remove it. For some companies that utilize Workday, they have a different type of P-card program where people can use it for all host of reasons, and they can use it even for personal, and by clicking that personal expense, it becomes a liability of the individual and not the P-card program.
Okay.
And we won't be utilizing this.
The next one is, are you able to change the work tags not through itemization? So if you need to change just 100% of the charge to another cost center.
Yep, so we're on the third transaction right now, so I can show you that one as well. So we'll say that this one is just 100% going to a different cost center. I'm trying to think with who this vendor is. So again, this is just going to be a supply, and we'll call this a lab and scientific supply. Again, I'll have to put in my business reason. Emergency supplies, and let's say this cost center, which is mine, I'm Ralph, remember, this isn't where it needs to go. It needs to go to maybe a research cost center. Oh, it just took me back to my defaulted one. So let me try something else here. Try just engineering. So yes, it can be changed at that point in time.
Okay. What happens if the cost center manager does not approve the expense?
I probably should ask for a little bit more of clarification of that. The cost center manager is the next person up in the workflow for these transactions, and they have an option of either denying a transaction, which means that it's can't go any further, or they can send something back. So I am not sure I understand what the purpose of the question is. Is there a little bit more clarification?
Yeah, we'll see if Rosemarie has any clarifications and we can keep moving.
Okay.
The next one's from Doris. I think you already answered it. Is, can the cost center manager change the work tags to split it out during their approval step? I believe it was yes, right?
Yes. Yep. When the cost center manager gets the transaction, they will, I'm going to go ahead and submit this, if that's okay, and I can bring up what the cost center would see, cost center manager would see. So the next person up would be the cost center manager. And that is going to be either Christina Renner or Lee Zerker in our test environment here. So here is that transaction, that expense report that Ralph submitted. It's the first one in Christina's mailbox. And you can see here that she can go into the transaction at each line level and make any changes that she feels need to happen.
Cool.
Okay.
Another question was back on the expensing page. The
Mhm.
receipt included box is not a red asterisk required field. Is that really a required step?
It is not a required step. We are asking people to check this box when they're attaching the receipt, because that will help us run reports to see where there is missing documentation, but it's not required.
Okay, and the last one from Rosemarie. If the card is already used and something is charged, what does a denial do in Workday?
The denial in Workday, I'm not sure if we actually tested denying a credit card expense, but you know, if the expense has already occurred, it does need to move out of that clearing account. And I'm struggling a little bit with how to answer this question. I'm hoping, Lisa, maybe you can add a little bit more to what the expectation is if a credit card expense is denied.
Sure, Robin. Like Robin, I can't necessarily articulate what happens in the system, but depending on the nature or reason of why you would want to deny a transaction, for example, if they accidentally put a personal expense on the P card, you would need to take the steps you would need to take to get them to write a check or collect that money from that individual in any way. If the transaction is something that's maybe permitted but not necessarily in accordance with policy, you'd want to process that through the exception process. And note that as an exception and still push the transaction through.
Thanks,
But
Lisa.
I can't
Thanks,
think of
Lisa.
another reason to deny a transaction.
Yeah, and that's one I struggle with a lot, but because it's just like today, we still have to process it.
Yep.
We still have to pay the bank for that credit card charge unless it, you know, it was fraud. But then we need to go down a different process for collecting that money back.
So, and I think Rosemary added one more clarifying question. In other words, there's no pre-approval in Workday. No, Workday was not built to gain pre-approval for department use cards. It's just not the way Workday was really built. So what we are recommending is that you use the log to check out a card, and this is where you need to hold the users of the card responsible. So they will be required to certify that they understand the policies and procedures associated with using a university P card. And if you have individuals who can't meet those expectations, they will not be permitted to check out a P card. And that's how you manage, that's how you need to manage that process.
So Jimmy, I did see that somebody asked what the yellow question marks were.
Oh, okay.
And I did just want to point this out, that what this is telling us is that the expense report was submitted more than 60 days after the travel end date. What that is saying is that we're doing this expense report, but the date of the credit card charge was back in January. And so again, we're just using test data. Hopefully in the real world and when we're in production, these shouldn't be popping up.
We have a couple more questions, and then I think maybe we turn it back to Holly to get to ISD. Another one came in about, can you deny a single line off of an expense report? I guess this would be as a cost center manager, or would you have to deny the entire expense report?
Right now, it would be denying the entire expense report.
Could the process move forward to submission without an attachment being included?
We have built validation in that will provide an error, a critical error that would not allow the transaction to go further without the attachment.
Next one, how often will the charges be loaded by PNC for expense report entry?
I'm
They will
not
be loaded daily, much like today.
Okay. Going
But
on
that's
to-
of course when the daily after the transaction hits the bank.
If the cost center manager forgets or ignores something, is there a clearing type of account that it will hit instead?
The transactions are, when they first are loaded from the bank, they are already in a clearing account. There is escalation built into Workday that alerts when something has gone beyond 2 days of being approved or moved through the process flow.
Okay. The next one, can you show what happens when there is an exception required and who does what?
I don't think I can show that today. I think that's something certainly we can take away for maybe a future demo, but I do not have data prepared for that to show today.
Okay, I lost my spot. What was the next one?
Move on to ISD if that's
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
because I definitely want to have a few minutes for that. And so these
Yeah.
are great questions. We
Yeah.
definitely can come back to the exception process and definitely taking these all down as things to make sure we're thinking of for the formal training that we'll be doing too. There is in general, just to answer Anna's question, I think there in general on most of our transactions, you will see a send back feature, which is really what we'd like the person approving to use if they feel like there's enough that needs to be changed on that, or sometimes it's approved, or depending on the type of transaction, the approver can't actually change anything. So you can use the send back to then communicate through comments and ask the person that submitted that to adjust the transaction and then basically just submit it again. So we see that as a way to also, when it makes sense, to help to educate and kind of get that person who's submitting these more on a regular basis to do that more completely when that makes sense. Okay, so we'll go ahead and thank you so much, Robin. Appreciate
Sure.
that. I know it's hard to type and demo like that in front of 172 people. Okay, so we will go on to just to take about 10 minutes here to talk about internal service delivery. So our first slide, Robin. There you go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so in general, what we'll be doing for internal purchases, so internal orders that we might call them today. So that e-request that you do today and you go in, you pick internal order, you'll be doing that instead through the Workday procurement process. So our internal vendors that you can select from today in e-request will be set up in Workday as internal suppliers. And in general, our processes for buying from an internal supplier will follow the same procurement processes that you've already seen that we showed you in that session back in January in terms of initiating and approving a purchase request. We have some new terminology here. We have what we're calling an internal service provider. The ISP is the actual earnings operation that will provide those goods and services to the university community. So, for example, the Blackwell or Uniprint are a couple common ones. Those are ISPs. And then we have, again, the terminology of an ISD, internal service delivery, which replaces the IDB that we do today, which actually is the recording of the revenue and expense. So again, that internal chargeback. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So some best practices and guidelines. So there are a couple of ways to get the ISD entry into Workday. One is if you're a smaller ISP, internal service provider, where you don't have a ton of activity, it's going to make sense maybe just to do a direct manual entry, just like you might do today again as a journal entry IDB in PeopleSoft. And in Workday, we're suggesting that if you're entering fewer than 5 lines, you would just do a direct manual entry for an ISD. We also have the ability to do a spreadsheet upload in Workday. Those are called EIBs. So again, if you're a unit, and I know Robin's been working with a lot of the units one-on-one here, but if you're a unit where you have, you know, hundreds of lines that you're loading or even thousands, you're going to want to use the spreadsheet upload process to load those. And then in general, we would like, or we are requiring that if there was a Workday receipt purchase order number, so purchase request number, that would be entered on the ISD or uploaded as part of the spreadsheet upload, that number is actually recorded there on the ISD, just so we have the tie back to the original approved purchase request. If the original approved purchase request was a quote or an estimate, we are asking that detailed actual cost information is then attached to the ISD. So again, that unit getting charged has the detail behind what was originally an estimate. So they have the detail behind the actual charges. And the difference from today is that these internal requests that are against a grant work tag would be, again, it's going to go through a purchase request, and those would split off and go, if it has a grants work tag on it, would go to the grant shared service center. So a couple examples of the process flows. So an example here, this would be a lot of what you might order through our main stores, chemistry store, gas warehouse. So again, the process starts out by the end user, and they would be starting out just as if they're doing a regular purchase request in Workday, either from an external supplier or internal supplier for and these items. They'd be going in through the marketplace to pick those items from those internal suppliers. And then the purchase request would go through all the normal workflow that we talked about before. So it'd go through cost center manager. So this is marketplace. So really in this case, it's really just going to go through the marketplace, through the marketplace and then through the cost center manager for approval. And then the department leader, again, if it's more than the 2,500 or in high risk. And remember, these internal service providers, we didn't outline in this because we've already talked through the procurement process, but it's a regular procurement process. So for marketplace, that would also go through the grant shared service center. If it was against an OSP grant, it would not go through the university service centers if it was on a university funding funds. And then there will be, we'll basically have an automatic integration here that will create the stock request, so basically fulfill the order. And then we will have an automatic process in which the internal service delivery, so that chargeback is generated and then posted. So this one is extremely automated process. We go to the next one. So we have a list of internal suppliers here down at the bottom that will be following this process at least for initial go live. And then after initial go live, we potentially can work on more that would make sense to be in the marketplace. But these are some of our larger internal suppliers that have goods and services that they are offering that makes sense to be in like a catalog format and could be out in the marketplace. So again, same process. They would be available out in the marketplace. The purchase request would go through the normal initiate approval processes. After that, the purchase order, after approvals, the purchase order would then be approved, and the ISP, the internal service provider, would receive a notification of that purchase order, an email notification that the order has been fulfilled. And Robin's been working with all those units, all the ISPs, to make sure we're getting that a good email address to make sure those are getting sent to, so that those POs go to the right people. and then the order would be fulfilled, and then the internal service provider would have their the data entry specialist would go ahead and initiate the ISD, again, either through that manual process we just talked about, or if it's a larger amount of transactions, through an EIB. In general, on these internal service provider entries, these ISDs, if the line item is over $3,000, it will go for an additional approval by the cost center manager. So this is, again, for ones that would go through the marketplace. And then I'll just get one question before we go into, I think there's a question there, but there is a large number. As you know, we have a couple hundred internal suppliers today. So all the other ones that you might do business with today, so some of those, potentially some of those smaller internal suppliers, but still important for you. So for example, arts and sciences. Oh yeah, here we go, perfect. Here's the slide. I didn't see that before. Okay, so some of these smaller units, like some of these ones I just pulled up on my spreadsheet, arts and sciences, machine shop, Chadwick, Arboretum, some of these smaller ones that just won't have a catalog. It would be, again, initiated through a purchase request, and it would just be kind of almost more like an e-request in terms of, you put your description of what you need, your estimated amount, and then again, it would route for all the approvals, and the PO would go out to the service provider, just like the one before. So really the only difference is on the first two, you're able to go through the marketplace. On the last one, it's really what we call a special request. All of it's happening though through the purchase request process. And again, then on the ISD side, on the internal billing side, any charges that are over $3,000 would require the cost center manager to then approve. So that, and then we do have a couple, just kind of, and I know we'll go to a couple of questions there. I know we're almost out of time. We do have a couple of vendors that we list below there, like OCIO ServiceNow, ULARI Protocol, eRamp, that we're working on some processes on, where for some of those you may actually start that process in their system. There's a few things like that we're still working through some details on. So I know that was a lot. So I really, are you guys still there? I lost my chat window there, Jimmy. Wait, hold on.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. Here we go. So can't really answer that first one about COVID-19. I know we're still, working through that. We're still pushing as hard as we can for our current go live. Okay, so let's see. We have maybe room for one question here. So Lisa, I want your help with this. The 3,000 approval for the ISP is new. In current state, we don't approve IDBs for the charges of any amounts. Yes, it is the CCM, the cost center manager, approving. That's correct. Seems a bit different than voucher expense approvals, which I understand will be approved by requester. Maybe I'm confused. So this really, what we were doing here is we were lining this up with the invoice approval threshold. Again, because a lot of times when you're doing that initial request, it might not have all the details that you would have in a more detailed purchase order. So again, lining this up with the voucher invoice approval threshold was our thought process here, and putting an additional control on this, where the cost center manager is seeing anything that's over $3,000 or over. I don't know, Lisa, if you have anything to add.
No, you got it, Holly.
Cool. Yeah, so I see the question about the encumbrances. We are still working through this because it does generate a PO. It does encumber. The purchase does encumber, but we are working on this because we don't have an ideal way to then unencumber once the ISD has hit. So we are working through this to see what we can do. At current state, we may be reversing all of those at the end of the month, kind of in bulk. That's what we're looking at. We would love to have something that's a little more enhanced, and we're going to be working with Workday on that to see if there's a way that we could better relieve those encumbrances with the ISD, but we're not quite there yet. I think we're out of time. I know that was a lot. If you have other questions, feel free to send them our way. I don't know, Jimmy, I'm sure you recorded if there were some we missed today.
Yep, we'll publish a list of the ones we couldn't answer, just like
Okay.
we've been doing in the past.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And everyone take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Yep, thanks, Ron. Thanks, guys.